Part 1. A New Beginning. My name is Sophie, and for the longest time, my world revolved around my son, Ethan. When his father passed away shortly after his birth, it was just the two of us. Those years were hard, financially and emotionally, but Ethan's laughter, his curiosity, and his trust in me made it all worth it. I poured everything into being his mother, balancing long hours at work and late nights at home. Through it all, Ethan grew up kind, thoughtful, and independent. But somewhere along the way, life shifted, and so did we. When I met Mark, I wasn't looking for love, but his warmth and humor were a welcome change from the years of solitude. He made me feel alive again, and for the first time, I thought I could have both, a partner and the close relationship I'd always shared with Ethan. Mark had 2 children from a previous marriage, Lisa, 16, and Jack, 14. They were polite, if a little distant, but I chalked it up to the awkwardness of blending families. I was confident we'd grow into something whole, something good. Ethan, however, was less enthused. He didn't voice any objections, but I could sense his hesitation. He visited less often, calling just enough to keep in touch, but always brief, always guarded. I convinced myself it was normal. After all, he was an adult now, carving his path. I was proud of him. But as I embraced my new life with Mark and his kids, I failed to notice how much space I had created between Ethan and me. When Ethan offered to take me on a trip to Greece, it felt like an olive branch. He had just earned a promotion and wanted to celebrate by treating me. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of love and gratitude. "You've done so much for me, Mom. Let me do this for you." I was deeply touched and immediately agreed. But then, I made a mistake. I asked if Mark and the kids could join us. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for everyone to bond. Ethan hesitated, but ultimately said yes. I was thrilled, imagining us all walking through ancient ruins and enjoying sunsets together. I didn't realize then how much I was asking of him. The trip began on a high note. We landed in Athens, and the excitement was palpable. The kids napped in Ethan's room while Mark and I took the adjoining one. It wasn't until later that night, when the kids remained in Ethan's room, that tensions began to surface. Ethan approached me privately, asking if the kids could move to our room. Before I could respond, Mark interjected with a laugh. "Come on, Sophie deserves a break. You can manage them for a few nights." Ethan's face fell, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked away. The next day, the unease lingered. Ethan was polite but distant. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just jet lag. But when he brought it up again, asking for space, Mark's response was curt. "You're here to treat your mom, aren't you? Consider this part of the deal." I stayed silent. I didn't agree with Mark's tone, but I convinced myself it was a small issue, one Ethan could handle. After all, he was generous enough to invite us. Surely, he could extend that generosity a bit further. But in hindsight, I see how unfair I was. I let Mark take control of a situation that should have been between Ethan and me. That night, Ethan left without a word. I woke up to find his room empty and his phone unreachable. Panic turned to anger. Why would he abandon us in a foreign country? I thought of all the effort I'd put into raising him, all the sacrifices, and how ungrateful this felt. Mark's frustration fueled my own, and for a moment, I let it overshadow the reality of the situation. But as the hours passed, the anger gave way to something deeper, guilt. I had taken Ethan's gesture of love and turned it into an obligation. I had let my new life with Mark overshadow the bond Ethan and I had built over decades. And now, he was gone, leaving behind only questions and a silence that was deafening. That day I realized that rebuilding my relationship with Ethan wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I was willing to try. Part 2. The trip that changed everything. When Ethan proposed the trip to Greece, it felt like a dream come true. His words, so simple yet profound, made my heart swell with pride. "You've done so much for me, Mom. Let me do this for you." I couldn't remember the last time someone had done something so thoughtful. Yet, when the euphoria subsided, practicality kicked in, and I hesitated. It wasn't just about me anymore. I had a husband now, Mark, and 2 stepchildren, Lisa and Jack. Could I really leave them behind for a trip like this? I told Ethan that I'd love to join him, but asked if Mark and the kids could come too. His pause was brief but telling. Still, he agreed. though the enthusiasm in his voice dimmed slightly. I convinced myself that this was the right choice. After all, a family vacation could be a beautiful bonding experience, a way for Ethan and Mark to finally connect and for the kids to get to know their older stepbrother better. My heart was in the right place, but in hindsight, I see now how much I misjudged the situation. We arrived in Athens after weeks of planning. The flight had been long, but excitement hung in the air. Ethan was quiet but courteous, helping with the luggage and ensuring everyone was comfortable. I noticed his interactions with Mark were minimal, but I brushed it off as travel fatigue. Lisa and Jack were thrilled to be on this adventure, chatting animatedly about the sights they wanted to see. At the hotel, the rooms were arranged in a way that seemed convenient at first. The kids napped in Ethan's room while Mark and I settled into ours. When evening came and the kids stayed put in Ethan's room, I assumed it was a temporary arrangement, but Ethan approached me later, visibly uncomfortable, asking if the kids could move to our room. Before I could respond, Mark interjected with a laugh, dismissing Ethan's concern. "Come on, Sophie deserves a break. You're a grown-up. You can handle it." Ethan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he walked away, leaving me torn. I knew Mark's tone had been dismissive, but I also thought Ethan might be overreacting. Mark was trying to make things easier for me, wasn't he? And the kids weren't difficult. They'd be asleep most of the time anyway. I convinced myself this was a minor issue, not worth dwelling on. The next day, tensions began to surface. Ethan was polite but distant. He joined us for sightseeing and meals but kept his interactions minimal. I tried to engage him, but he seemed preoccupied. When he brought up the room arrangement again, asking for more space, Mark's response was even harsher. "You're here to treat your mom, aren't you? Consider this part of the deal." I stayed silent, torn between defending my son and preserving the harmony of my new family. In my silence, I made a choice, one that I would soon regret. That night, Ethan disappeared. I woke up to find his room empty and his belongings gone. Panic set in as I tried to reach him, but his phone was off. When I checked with the hotel staff, they informed me that he had checked out in the middle of the night. My initial reaction was anger. How could he leave us like this? He had invited us after all. Didn't he understand how much this trip meant to me? Mark's reaction only added fuel to the fire. He was livid, blaming Ethan for being selfish and immature. "He's always been spoiled," Mark muttered, his words stinging more than I expected. It wasn't true. Ethan had never been spoiled. If anything, he had always been independent, almost to a fault. But in my frustration, I let Mark's words shape my perspective. Instead of seeing Ethan's departure as a cry for help, I saw it as an act of rebellion. Lisa and Jack seemed unfazed, treating the situation as a minor inconvenience. They didn't understand the gravity of what had happened, and I didn't blame them. To them, Ethan was just their stepbrother, a distant figure they barely knew. But for me, this was a breaking point. I felt like I was losing the son I had raised, the one who had always been my anchor. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on the trip, but it was impossible. Every corner of Athens reminded me of Ethan, his excitement when he first mentioned the Parthenon, his careful itinerary planning, his quiet pride in treating me to this experience. Guilt began to seep in, overshadowing my initial anger. I replayed every interaction, every decision, and saw how I had failed him. Mark, however, remained unyielding. "He's a grown man. If he wants to throw a tantrum, let him," he said dismissively. His lack of empathy stunned me. This wasn't just a tantrum. This was Ethan telling us something was deeply wrong. But by the time I realized this, it felt too late. Ethan didn't respond to my messages or calls. His silence was deafening, a void that no sightseeing or lavish meals could fill. The trip, which had started as a celebration, now felt hollow. I had wanted to create memories, but all I was left with was regret. As the days passed, I began to see things more clearly. This wasn't just about the trip. It was about years of neglect, of putting my new family first and assuming Ethan would always be there, waiting. It was about my silence when I should have spoken up, my hesitation to stand by my son when he needed me most. By the time we returned home, I knew things had to change. But I also knew that repairing my relationship with Ethan wouldn't be easy. He had every right to be hurt, and it was up to me to prove that I valued him, not through words, but through actions. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my choices, and I was determined to make things right. Part 3. The breaking point. The silence after Ethan's departure was unbearable. I hadn't realized how much his presence anchored the trip until it was gone. Mark and the kids continued with the itinerary as if nothing had happened, but their forced cheerfulness only made the emptiness more pronounced. My mind raced with questions. Had I misunderstood Ethan's feelings? Had I failed him as a mother? And most hauntingly, was this the beginning of a permanent rift? Mark's reaction didn't help. He dismissed Ethan's departure as childish and selfish, making comments that stung more than they should have. If he's going to throw a fit over something so trivial, maybe he didn't deserve the promotion in the first place, he scoffed over breakfast. Lisa and Jack, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, seemed to take Mark's side by default. They echoed his sentiments, calling Ethan dramatic and difficult. I wanted to defend my son, to point out that he wasn't just throwing a fit. This was about years of feeling overshadowed, unappreciated, and perhaps even replaced. But every time I opened my mouth, fear held me back. Fear of rocking the already unstable boat that was my marriage. Fear of alienating Mark and his kids. Fear of admitting, even to myself, that Ethan had a right to feel the way he did. I tried to reach out to Ethan multiple times, but my calls went unanswered. The text messages I sent were met with silence, each unread notification a reminder of how deeply I had hurt him. My frustration turned into defensiveness. How could he leave us like that in a foreign country? Didn't he know how much I cared for him? How much this trip was supposed to mean? That night, I vented my feelings to Mark. He's my son, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want to lose him. Mark barely looked up from his tablet. You're not losing him. He's just being unreasonable. Give him time, and he'll come crawling back. Something about his tone, so dismissive, so devoid of empathy, made my stomach churn. You don't understand, I snapped. This isn't just about the room or the trip. This is about how he feels in this family. Mark finally looked at me, his expression hard. Sophie, I've tried with Ethan. He doesn't want to be part of this family. That's not on me. That's on him. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew Ethan's feelings weren't entirely unwarranted. Since marrying Mark, I had focused so much on blending our families that I hadn't stopped to consider how Ethan might feel. I had assumed he would adjust, just as I had, but I hadn't made the effort to bridge the gap. I had expected him to meet me halfway without realizing that I was the one who had moved. The next day, I tried one last time to find Ethan. I asked the hotel staff if they had any information, but all they could tell me was that he had checked out. I thought about calling his friends or even his workplace, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was guilt. Either way, I left it alone. Instead, I focused on the trip, or rather, I pretended to. We visited the Acropolis, took a ferry to the islands, and dined at picturesque seaside restaurants. But the joy was gone. Each moment felt hollow, overshadowed by the absence of my son. Even Lisa and Jack began to pick up on the tension, their laughter quieter, their energy subdued. Mark, however, seemed unfazed. He carried on as if nothing had happened, throwing himself into planning the next activity and ignoring the strained silences that filled our meals. It was as if Ethan's absence validated his belief that my son was the problem, not the family dynamic. The breaking point came 3 days later when I received a message from Ethan. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a simple note. I'm fine. Please stop calling. My heart sank. The formality of his words stung more than any argument ever could. It was as if he was drawing a line in the sand, telling me that I was no longer welcome on his side of it. Mark saw the message and scoffed. See, he's fine. You're worrying for nothing. But I wasn't fine, and neither was Ethan. And pretending otherwise wasn't going to fix anything. That night, I lay awake in our hotel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the past few days. I thought about the sacrifices I had made for Mark and his kids, the ways I had tried to create a new family while holding on to my old one. I thought about Ethan's childhood, the bond we had shared, and how it had unraveled over the years. I thought about the look on his face when Mark had dismissed him, the way his shoulders had sagged as he walked away. And for the first time, I admitted to myself that I had failed him. It wasn't just about this trip. It was about every moment since I had remarried, when I had prioritized Mark's comfort over Ethan's feelings. It was about the times I had stayed silent when Mark's comments crossed a line, The times I had brushed off Ethan's concerns as overreactions, the times I had expected him to fit into a mold that wasn't designed for him. By the time the trip ended, I felt like a stranger in my own family. Mark's presence, once a source of stability, now felt suffocating. Lisa and Jack, who I had once seen as extensions of my own love for Mark, now seemed like reminders of what I had lost. And Ethan, my son, was nowhere to be found. The flight home was silent. Mark sensed my mood and didn't push. Lisa and Jack were engrossed in their devices, oblivious to the tension. But in my heart, I knew this was more than just a bad trip. This was a turning point, a moment that would either bring my family together or break it apart. I didn't know which outcome I feared more. Part 4. The strain of reflection. The fallout from Ethan's abrupt departure in Greece hit me like a tidal wave. Once the immediate frustration subsided, I found myself grappling with the consequences of my silence. My son had walked away, not just from the trip, but from me, and it felt like a sharp severance of the bond we'd once shared. Mark didn't seem fazed. "He'll get over it," he said dismissively, lounging in the hotel room. "He just needs to realize the world doesn't revolve around him." His words struck me as cold, yet I didn't muster the courage to counter them. His kids, Lisa and Jack, seemed more concerned about their disrupted vacation than about the tension enveloping us. I felt isolated, surrounded by people who didn't seem to understand or care about what Ethan's departure meant. I tried reaching out to Ethan again, leaving voicemails he never answered. "Ethan, can we just talk? I want to understand. Please call me back." Each unanswered call deepened my sense of guilt and inadequacy. For the first time, I began to truly question my role in the family dynamic that had driven him away. Back home, Mark's behavior started to grate on me in ways I could no longer ignore. His attitude towards Ethan had always been subtly dismissive, but now it felt like outright contempt. "He's just trying to punish you," Mark said one evening as I scrolled through old photos of Ethan and me from his childhood. "You shouldn't let him manipulate you." Manipulate me. The idea seemed absurd. Ethan wasn't playing games. He was asserting himself in a way he never had before. And if it felt like punishment, maybe it was because I had let him down in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. As weeks passed, I found myself increasingly introspective. I replayed moments from the trip in my mind, scrutinizing every interaction for signs I had missed. Why had I let Mark dictate so much of what happened? Why had I stayed silent when my son needed me to stand up for him? The truth was harsh. I had prioritized maintaining peace with Mark over defending Ethan, and in doing so, I had betrayed the trust my son had placed in me. When Ethan finally responded to my messages, it wasn't the heartfelt reunion I had hoped for. Instead, he sent a curt text. "I need space. Please respect that." The bluntness stung, but I respected his wishes. I stopped calling, though the silence felt unbearable. My mind raced with worries about how to fix what had been broken, or if it could be fixed at all. Meanwhile, things with Mark grew more strained. His dismissive attitude towards Ethan was now seeping into our relationship. During an argument about the trip, he said something that cut me to the core. "You've spoiled him his whole life. No wonder he acts like this." "Excuse me?" I snapped, my voice trembling with anger. "Ethan isn't spoiled. He's hurt. And you have no right to talk about him like that." Mark scoffed. "He's acting like a brat, Sophie. And you're enabling him by pandering to his tantrum." For the first time, I saw Mark's true colors, and it wasn't a pretty sight. His lack of empathy for Ethan mirrored a deeper disregard for the values I held dear. I had married him hoping to build a family, but instead, I'd been complicit in creating a wedge between my old life and my new one. That realization shook me. It wasn't just Mark's behavior, it was mine too. I had let myself become passive, allowing his assertiveness to overshadow my instincts, and now, the price of that passivity was the fractured relationship with my son. I decided to confront Ethan one last time. I needed to hear his side, even if it meant facing hard truths. I showed up unannounced at his apartment, unsure if he would even open the door. When he did, his expression was guarded, but he let me in. "What do you want, Mom?" he asked, his voice neutral but distant. "I want to apologize," I said, my voice cracking. "I want to understand, and I want to fix this." Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Fix what, exactly?" "This isn't just about the trip, Mom. It's about everything." He spoke with a clarity that left no room for denial. He told me how he had felt overshadowed ever since Mark and his kids entered our lives, how he had been pushed aside in favor of a new family dynamic that he never asked for, how my silence during the trip felt like a betrayal, a confirmation that he wasn't as important to me as I had claimed. Tears streamed down my face as I listened. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," I whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to make everyone happy." "Well, you didn't," Ethan replied bluntly, "and I'm done waiting for things to change." His words were a gut punch, but they were necessary. For years, I had tried to juggle my old family and my new one, believing I could keep everyone happy if I just tried hard enough. But in doing so, I had neglected the most important relationship in my life, the one with my son. As I left his apartment, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The conversation had been painful, but it was also the first real dialogue we'd had in years. Ethan's boundaries were clear, and I knew I had a long road ahead if I wanted to earn back his trust. Back at home, I began to reevaluate everything: my marriage, my priorities, and the kind of mother I wanted to be. Mark's dismissive attitude towards Ethan now felt intolerable, and I found myself questioning whether our relationship could survive such fundamental differences. Ethan's absence was a void I couldn't ignore, but it was also a wake-up call. If I truly loved him, and I did, it was time to start showing it in ways that mattered. Part 5. Choosing the path forward. The days following my conversation with Ethan were heavy with reflection. His words echoed in my mind, each one a reminder of the ways I had failed to balance my love for him with the demands of my new life. His decision to step away from the family dynamics that had caused him pain wasn't just a rejection of the trip. It was a statement about his worth, one that I had neglected to affirm when it mattered most. Mark, on the other hand, reacted to Ethan's absence with frustration veiled as indifference. "He's always been overly sensitive," he said one night as we sat in tense silence at the dinner table. His words cut deeper than I let on. This wasn't just about sensitivity. This was about respect, something Mark seemed unwilling to extend to my son. Our arguments about Ethan became more frequent and pointed. Mark blamed me for coddling him, insisting that Ethan's behavior was the result of being spoiled. But I saw things differently now. Ethan wasn't spoiled. He was hurt. He had been marginalized in ways I had failed to see because I was too busy trying to keep the peace. The realization filled me with a mix of guilt and resolve. I couldn't undo the past, but I could change how I responded moving forward. I began to withdraw from Mark emotionally, a shift that didn't go unnoticed. His irritation grew, and his patience waned. "You're letting him manipulate you," he accused one evening. "He's making you choose between him and us." It wasn't manipulation, it was clarity. For the first time, I saw how much I had compromised my relationship with Ethan to maintain harmony with Mark and his kids. And now that harmony felt shallow, built on a foundation that couldn't withstand the weight of real conflict. One night, after yet another argument, Mark crossed a line. In his frustration, he compared me to his ex-wife, a woman he had often described as negligent and selfish. "At least she didn't let the kids walk all over her," he spat, his words laced with venom. That was the breaking point. I realized then that Mark's presence in my life had come at too great a cost. His disregard for Ethan and his inability to empathize with my struggles as a mother had eroded any sense of partnership I thought we had. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, I sat down with Mark and told him I needed time apart. "This isn't working," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I need to focus on my relationship with Ethan, and I can't do that with this constant tension." Mark's response was predictably defensive. He accused me of abandoning him and his kids, of choosing Ethan over the family we had built together. But his words no longer held the power they once did. I wasn't choosing between two families. I was choosing to rebuild the one I had neglected. With Mark out of the picture, I reached out to Ethan again. This time, I didn't try to justify my actions or ask for immediate forgiveness. I simply told him the truth, that I had made mistakes, and that I was ready to do the work to make things right. Ethan's response was cautious but encouraging. He didn't open the door wide, but he left it ajar. "It'll take time," he said, "but I'm willing to see where this goes." In the weeks that followed, I began to rediscover myself, not as Mark's wife or a stepmother, but as Ethan's mother. I spent more time reflecting on our past, on the moments when I had let him down and the ways I could show up for him now. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the weight of regret felt overwhelming. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. My relationship with Mark ended quietly, without the dramatic fallout I had feared. He moved out, taking his kids with him, and I was left with a silence that felt more like peace than emptiness. It was a bittersweet transition, but it was necessary. I couldn't continue to split my loyalty between two worlds when one had clearly caused so much harm to the other. As I started to rebuild my relationship with Ethan, I noticed a shift in him as well. He seemed lighter, more confident. The boundaries he had set were firm, but they were also a sign of growth, his way of reclaiming his identity after years of feeling overshadowed. I respected those boundaries, knowing they were a necessary part of our healing process. One evening, as we sat together over coffee, I asked Ethan what he hoped for our future. His answer was simple but profound. I just want us to be real with each other. Real? It was a word that carried so much weight, yet it felt like exactly what we needed. No more pretending, no more putting on a facade for the sake of appearances. Just honesty, even when it was hard. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was one I was willing to take. For Ethan, for myself, for the chance to rebuild what we had lost. Part 6. A Journey Toward Healing. Months after the chaos surrounding Ethan's bold stand, a new rhythm had started to emerge within our family. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but there was a genuine effort to shift the dynamics that had caused so much pain. The process wasn't smooth. Old habits die hard, and we often stumbled. But every small step forward felt significant, as if we were learning to walk together for the first time. Ethan had grown into himself in a way none of us could ignore. His confidence wasn't loud or overbearing. It was steady, a quiet assertion of his worth. The cruise seemed to have been a transformative experience for him. The photos he shared, of breathtaking sunsets, candid moments with friends, and serene ocean vistas, spoke volumes about the peace he had found within himself. He returned not seeking approval or revenge, but simply ready to live on his own terms. When we met again, it was just the two of us, sitting across from each other in a cozy cafe. It was the first meaningful conversation we'd had in years. I've been thinking a lot about the past, I began, my words careful but honest. I didn't see it before, Ethan. The way things were, the way you were treated, it wasn't fair. And I'm sorry. Ethan's response surprised me. He wasn't angry or dismissive. Instead, he leaned back and gave a small, understanding smile. I appreciate that, he said simply. I think I needed to go through all of it to understand myself better. But hearing it from you, it means something. Our parents struggled more openly with their guilt. Mom overcompensated by flooding Ethan with texts and invitations, while Dad attempted to make amends through acts of service, offering to help with repairs or running errands. Ethan accepted these gestures with patience, but maintained his boundaries. It wasn't resentment that held him back. It was self-respect. He needed them to meet him where he was, not where they wanted him to be. Alex, predictably, avoided the subject altogether. He deflected with work or brushed off attempts at deeper conversations. I couldn't tell if it was shame or indifference, but Ethan didn't seem to care either way. Alex has his own stuff to work through, he once said with a shrug. I'm not waiting on him anymore. For me, the hardest part was confronting my complicity. I had benefited from the favoritism that sidelined Ethan, and coming to terms with that was painful, but it also spurred me to change. I began reaching out to Ethan more intentionally, not out of guilt, but because I wanted to. I wanted to know him, not just as my brother, but as the person he had fought so hard to become. As time passed, I saw small but meaningful shifts in our parents. They started including Ethan more thoughtfully in family plans and listening to him in a way they hadn't before. There were still missteps. Old patterns resurfaced now and then, but the effort was there. Ethan's boundaries kept everyone accountable, a testament to his growth and resilience. The turning point came one evening when we gathered for dinner. It wasn't a grand event, just a simple meal at home, but the atmosphere felt different. The conversation flowed easily. Laughter replaced the tension that had once been palpable. For the first time, Ethan was treated not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of the family. He seemed at ease, his presence unassuming yet undeniable. After dinner, as we lingered at the table, I found myself watching Ethan. He was laughing with Alex, their exchange light and unguarded. Our parents were listening intently as he recounted a story from his trip, their expressions a mix of pride and regret. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. We weren't a perfect family. We probably never would be. But we were trying. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Ethan had shown us what it meant to stand up for yourself, to demand respect not through anger but through unwavering self-assurance. He had changed us, not by asking for it, but by showing us how. That night, as I hugged Ethan goodbye, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. "I'm proud of you." His smile was small, but it carried a weight I couldn't put into words. "Thanks, Claire," he said. "That means a lot." As I walked away, I realized we were finally on the path to healing, not just as individuals, but as a family. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time, I believed it was possible. And that, I knew, was more than enough.